On today's episode, Dimma to the Suns is official. Is this year's trade period going to be a frenzy or a fizzer? And we take a look at the last round of the MVP. All that and more on today's episode of Zero Hanger TV. All right, Mitch, so straight into it. Dimma is over at the Suns. Are they now out of excuses?
Yeah, well, a 6-year deal, so it's pretty telling on how much they're backing him in to finally not only take him into the top 8, but take him really far towards the top of the competition. So 2029 is when that deal will expire. It can really go in one of two ways. It's hard to see a coach last that long and stay at the levels they've stayed at. So really they see him taking them to premiership contention, and they've already got their sights on finals for next year. They've flagged that that's the business they're in for. They want to be a top 8 side next year. With Dimma at the helm, with the list they've got, and with some of the players that could be joining them through the draft this year, they're definitely going to have the pieces in place to be contending next year for a final spot, and then the years after potentially looking at their first flag.
Yeah. Do you think they're going to be making finals next year? A bit early, but
it's interesting. I think if you look at, I don't think they're going to make a huge move in the trade movement space. I think they'll be relying on a lot of their younger players. They'll have Ben King next year, so that's a big factor in their success. And Jed Walter, who is their leading academy prospect, is a ready-made talent. He's 200 centimeters. I think he's like almost 100 kilos heavy. So he'd be pretty ready to at least compete for a spot alongside King. And then they've got guys like Levi Casbolt, Marbiel Scholes. So they've got names that can definitely have an impact that are going to join the club. Whether it's experienced names they're going to be bringing in remains to be seen. But I think a lot of the pieces there, as Dimma mentioned, for their first premiership side are already at the club.
Yeah. Well, speaking of experienced names, there's another big one in Dusty. Will he be following Dimma to the Suns?
I'd preface this by saying no. I don't think he'll be away from Richmond in 2024. Whereas after that, who knows? It's the last year of his lucrative 7-year deal that he signed at the end of 2017, his career best season, and he's cashing in next year more than he has before. And I think that's supposed to be a very back-ended deal, and he's looking at a 1.4 million. That fair loan the Suns I wouldn't have thought can pay for, but I think there is a win-win situation that can play out here if they're, both clubs are open to the move. Obviously, firstly, Dusty would have to be the one that would be keen on going up north and joining Dimma. The Richmond would also have to be open to parting ways with him, and the Suns would also be needing to find ways to fit him in. So I think that an obvious few pieces that trade will circle around is obviously Martin and the Suns' first pick. So that's pick 4, pick 5. They need to get rid of that anyway to get those academy kids in. Now, I think the Tigers have a couple extra later picks thereafter at 25 and 43. So they're their first couple of selections for the draft. They package those with Martin, try and get that first round pick in return. Now, whether the Suns are okay with giving up a potential pick 4 for Martin, who's above 30, going to take a fair bit of money in their salary cap, and a couple of selections that will help get those academy kids. It won't necessarily get it over the line, but will certainly help. Then I think that the next steps in any negotiations will be just how much that Richmond would be willing to pay for his contract. So if it's 1.4 million, if the Tigers can half up, 700,000, so they're paying 700,000 each. Is that going to be okay for the Suns, adding 700,000 to their already seemingly tight salary cap? Is it going to be okay for Richmond to fork up that much? Now, you also have to think that they're opening up 700,000 in their salary cap, and that might not be for next year. They're not going to be bringing in any big players, I don't think, this off season, but it can allow someone like a Tim Taranto to have some money moved to his 2024 season as part of his wage, and then that can open 700,000 up at a later year when they do want to make a bit of a splash. So there's a lot that would have to play out. As I said at the start, I don't see it happening, but there's a win-win scenario there somewhere.
Yeah. Interesting. All right, so moving over to the 2023 trade period. Now, fizzer or frenzy?
It's interesting. I think off the back of West Coast moving off pick 1, it could certainly tilt its way towards being a bit of a fizzer. Now, firstly, you've got a lot of players who have actually re-signed or recommitted or said they're staying despite getting a lot of interest. You're looking at someone like Tom Barrass, who was contracted and is contracted for another 4 or so seasons, having interest from Sydney. You look at Harrison Himmelberg, Tom de Koning, Jake Riccardi is one of the latest ones who had interest, is now re-signed. So a lot of these, guys who are getting a lot of interest and for some high-priced deals are turning their back and sticking with those clubs. And then you look at guys like Sava Radaglia, so he's going to have more interest in him from a club like Sydney, who's put their attention towards a Mackay or a Himmelberg or a De Koning or a Barras, and now they'll be putting their attention elsewhere. So Ben Mackay, who probably still is an interested one for Sydney, looks likely to go to Essendon. Radaglia tipped to go to Port Adelaide. There are other clubs that are interested in him, but it seems like a lot of the moves that we can anticipate, we might already know their likely landing spot, and it's kind of leaving only a little bit of questions around some of the other bigger names. So Darcy Parish, stay or go. It seems like he might stay, but if there's an answer for where he would go next, it's probably Geelong. So there aren't a lot of open, questions for the trade period as much as we would have thought. Maybe some guys like Tom Duday is another one. I'm not too sure where he's at. And then it does come down like a lot of contracted guys and a lot of these players who aren't really on the trade space too early into the season until maybe their position gets thrown out into question. So Brodie Grundy's an obvious one, Bailey Smith another, Dustin Martin as we mentioned before. So I'm not seeing it as being a really big trade period, especially compared to last year when you had, I think, picks 1, 2, 7, and 8 all swap hands, plus Jason Horne-Francis leaving. Then you've got guys like Isaac Rankin, Luke Jackson, Josh Dunkley, just a heap of star talent and high assets that moved clubs. So I'm tipping it's going to be a bit of a fizzer, but if North Melbourne manage to win this weekend and pick one goes back to West Coast, it certainly could open up a few more trade avenues with a lot of clubs wanting to probably thinking they've got a better chance of getting pick one from West Coast than they would from North Melbourne. Hard to see North passing on selecting Harley Reid and moving on pick one. And given that they could have compensation for pick 2 if they have pick 1, and on top of that, if they get that priority access to Riley Sanders. So that's 3 of the top, maybe 6 prospects in the draft potentially going to North Melbourne without them having to trade with pick 1. So of those 3, one of them is Harley Reid, who's the obviously top draft prospect. So yeah, it won't all center around pick 1, but I think it's going to be a pretty big part in whether trade period's a fizzer or a bit of a frenzy.
Yeah, trade period always throws up some surprises somewhere, So let's hope for that. All right, so moving over to our rookie rankings, and they look pretty much set, only one change.
Yeah, it's just the ones, Judd McVie taking over Bailey Humphrey, and I think between those two and the third place, Max Marcolini, it's pretty close between them. Judd McVie was pretty solid against Hawthorn. Bailey Humphrey acquired a couple of weeks, you'd say, for the Suns, and I think that's the second week in a row he's fallen back. Harry Sheezel, as we've mentioned for the last few weeks, holding top spot and will do so into the end of the season, and even broke the record for most touches by a first-year player over the weekend. So that kind of solidifies his spot at number 1. Will Ashcroft, as we've mentioned as well, holds number 2. Those next 3 players that we named in 3, 4, and 5. And then you've got guys like Josh Weddle, so he moved up last week ahead of Ruben Jimby at 7, and then Elijah Hewitt at 8. And I think Elijah Hewitt, given some of his form, he could potentially take over Ruben Jimby in that 7th spot with 1 week left.
Yep, interesting stuff. Right, and honourable mentions?
Pretty big one was Henry Huswaite.
Yep.
Nice debut against the D's, couple goals, few touches. Obviously won't be eligible for our rookie rankings next year, given he's played this year. Certainly one to watch for the Rising Star Award for 2024, perhaps. A couple others, Josh Fay for the Giants has been putting together a pretty solid case when he gets a long string of minutes on field. And another one as well was around Rising Star nomination, Matt Johnson, who I think just sits outside our rookie rankings as well at this point in the season.
Yep, interesting stuff. All right, so moving over to some trade targets now. So first one, we're looking at Port Adelaide. So who are they going to be looking at?
Yeah, as we also mentioned earlier in the show, Sava Radaglia is an obvious one. They want some key defensive stocks added to their list. Now, they've got a lot of guys who are probably on the fringe or not getting minutes. And they just want to better that if they're going to strengthen their own premiership prospects. So Radaglia is one who they went for last year and is now off contract, so they're seen as the leading club for him. So they want a ruckman. They've got, I think, 3 off contract. The only one that is contracted might be Dante Vizentini, who they've seen a little bit of, but same with their defensive, options. They want a maybe more experienced one that can help lead them here and now. And, Brodie Grundy's a pretty obvious one. SA Link, probably weighing up his future as much as, speculation kind of goes back and forth on where he's at. And another ruck option that might be a bit cheaper for them that has some experience is Matt Flynn from GWS off contract. And then a couple other guys that might help their back line, not necessarily key position defenders, but a bit smaller, but certainly can play tall and small. So Trey Roscoe, not a SA kid, I think he's from WA, but off contract at Collingwood. Will Gould, who's from South Australia, struggles to get minutes at the Swans. could be one that Port Adelaide consider as a cheaper option as well.
Yep, good stuff. All right, and we're also going to look at some trade targets for the Tigers.
Yeah, interesting one. We had Hayden McLean. It sounds like he's probably going to re-sign with Sydney, but he'd be perfect for them. Someone that can play forward in the ruck. Same with St Kilda as well. We're probably going to have him for the Saints, but I think you'll probably pass on him with just where the direction of his future's heading, and it sounds like it will be at Sydney. But a few other options for the Tigers to consider. We've mainly looked around their midfield group, maybe getting a bit more polish on the outside. So guys like James Jordan, Liam Henry, Jeremy Sharp, Dill Stevens, all four of those guys off contracts. Jordan's a free agent. So some of these guys might not cost them too much, and they can just get a bit more run and speed and certainly complement the guys like Tim Taranto and Jacob Hopper in that midfield group.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Good stuff. A lot of movement for the Tigers, I think, in this off-season.
Yeah.
All right. So to finish up, as always, we're going to take a look at the Zero Hanger MVP. We've got one round left. As we said last week, it's a two-man race. But Petrarca can still take over Bont if he has a good game.
Yeah. Didn't poll on the weekend. Bont got a few votes, but it's still either one of them can take it heading into the final round. So the Bont's got a 13-vote gap over Petrarca. It's going to make for a pretty enticing finish. Now, obviously, the Western Bulldogs will play Geelong. Petrarca's Demons will play Sydney. So some pretty important games in both of those matches. So we'll see who steps up. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see just how our MVP race finishes. So be sure to look out next week, just to when the votes come through, to see who's taking the crown for that one.
Yeah. And is Dacos locked in at third, or is it still up for grabs?
There are a few players who can take third spot. So off the back of some pretty strong performances on the weekend, Errol Goulden and Lachie Neale are now equal fourth, and they're right in the mix if they poll enough votes and can surpass Nick Dacos. And the other one is Tim Taranto as well. So there's three players there that can finish on the podium, and obviously Nick Dacos can fall off given he hasn't played the last couple of weeks and won't play in the final round either. So yeah, it could be some more movement from third onwards.
Good stuff. All right, we're going to come down to the wire. But that wraps it up for this episode of Zero Hangout TV. Thanks, Mitch.
Thanks, Phoenix.
Don't forget, we'll do our mailbag episode on Thursdays. So if you want to get involved, send in a hot take or a talking point or a question, send them in through our socials at Zero Hanger on Instagram. You can subscribe to all the latest AFL news on the website and catch all the latest AFL news at zerohanger.com.